Hello student, welcome to lecture 2.1 Early Africans in the English colonies in North America. In this lecture we will talk about the first English colony in North America, which was Jamestown in Virginia and the Chesapeake region, and then we will talk about the rise of tobacco plantation, the status of indentured servants, and then the first Africans in Jamestown, and the emergence of chattel slavery. Next, we will talk about Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion, the plantation system, and the life of the slaves in the early colony. And at the end, we will talk about the case of miscegenations and creolization, which means mixing of races. And finally, the case of Anthony Johnson, who was one of the early Africans who came to North America. You may know a little bit about Jamestown and the first colony in North America, but some of you may not know anything at all about this colony. So this lecture will be a quick summary of the history of Jamestown. So, the first English colony or settlement in North America was founded at Jamestown in 1607, and that was the beginning of the 13 English colonies in North America, which would become the United States of America today. Jamestown was located in the Chesapeake region in Virginia. The initial objective of the settlers was to find gold, so they were sent over here by the English king to find gold, but after a few years they didn't find anything, so in the end they turned to the plantation of tobacco just to survive. So this map shows us the 13 English colonies in North America, which would become the United States of America starting from 1776. You can also see on this map the division between the southern colonies, which include Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. And that's where most of the slaves were concentrated. And then you have the middle colonies, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. And then at the top you have the New England colonies of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. We will come back to the different colonies in this lecture and in the next lecture. So, what is the origin of tobacco plantation in Virginia? By the time when the English came over here in the early 1600s, tobacco was already known in Europe. It was actually popular. It was brought by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and it was spread all over Europe. However, with regard to the English colonies, it was John Rolfe in 1612 who first experimented the cultivation of tobacco in Jamestown. And soon after that, the plantation of this plant of tobacco grew exponentially and became the main cash crop that brought money to the colony and allowed it to survive. But tobacco require a lot of workers, so the first workers that were brought to Jamestown were poor Englishmen who were hired as indentured servants. So what is an indentured servant? We have to understand this term because we will talk a lot about indentured servant in this lecture. So an indentured servant was not a slave, nor was it a free person. So according to the definition by Wikipedia, and we can trust Wikipedia here, an indentured servant or indentured laborer was an employee within a system of unfree labor who is bound by a signed or force contract or indenture to work without pay for the owner of the indenture for a period of time. So the key words here is contract. The contract is the indenture. So an indentured servant is a person who signed a contract to work for free for another person. And we will see on the next slide that the first Africans who came to Jamestown were treated as indentured servants and not as slaves. So let's talk about these first Africans who arrived in Jamestown. The very first Africans who were brought to Jamestown came in 1619. So 1619 is a very important date in African American history. There's still a debate about the exact number of these first Africans, but there are some records that tells us that they were 20 and odd, which means that they are about 20, which means also that the number is not exactly 20. With regards to the status, some people also call them enslaved Africans. However, they should not be considered slaves, but even though they were not free either. And the reason for this is that England and its colony did not have slave laws, and England didn't have slaves, did not practice slavery since the Middle Age. And another thing also that we have to keep in mind, some of these Angolans, some of these Africans who came from Angola were Christians. And there was a well-respected tradition among Christians, and the English were Christians. So according to this tradition, a Christian person should not enslave another Christian. So the first Africans, some of them should not have been a slave at all. So the early Africans who came most likely were given the status of indentured servant, and we will talk about one of them, Anthony Johnson, at the end of this lecture, which shows clearly that Anthony Johnson was not a slave, but he was treated as an indentured servant. However, by 1640, these first Africans were forced to serve their master for life. So if someone is forced to serve for life, the status of that person is similar to that of a slave. So by the 1640s, most of the Africans were actually treated as slaves. And finally, by 1660s, their status was changed to that of chattel slaves. So this is a legal status that was written in the book. So what is a chattel slave? According to the Abolition Project, a chattel slave is an enslaved person who is owned by another person. So a person who's owned forever, and whose children and the children's children are automatically enslaved. In addition to that, chattel slaves are individuals treated as complete property, which means that they could be sold and bought. So as you can see, the status of chattel slave was totally different from that of an indentured servant, and it was also different from the status of slaves in Africa and other parts of the world, where the status was not permanent. It was not for a lifetime. You can be slave one day, but you can be free the next day. In Africa and other places, and most important, the children of slaves in Africa and other parts of the world, the children of slaves were not treated as slaves themselves. So what happened to the status of indentured servant? Why did the English stop using indentured servants? The rebellion led by Nathaniel Bacon in 1676 had to do with that. Nathaniel Bacon was a former indentured servant, but he became free at the end of his contract, so he recovered his freedom. In 1676, he led a rebellion with black slaves and free blacks, as well as white indentured servants. So he led this rebellion against the rich planters of Virginia. The reason for that rebellion was that he and his fellow indentured servant, they want land, but the rich planter didn't allow them to own lands. So, but Bacon died before the rebellion occurred. Nevertheless, the dramatic effect of this tentative rebellion was that the rich planters, the plantation owners, stopped using indentured servants from that day. So they completely do away with the status of indentured servant and totally rely on African slaves. So the slaves were held on plantation. That's where they spent most of their lives. So what is a plantation? According to Wikipedia, a plantation is a large-scale estate meant for farming that specializes in cash crops. So a plantation it's a large piece of land that was dedicated for the production of just one crop. For instance, tobacco or cotton. So that's the main activity on the plantation. So the slaves' living conditions on the plantation vary from one to another. On some plantation, if a master just own a few slaves, maybe 2 or 3, then these masters have to work together with their slaves. If they have more, maybe up to 10 or 50 or even thousands, the master can divide them among different plantations. So what do the slaves do on the plantation? By the mid-1700s, nearly all of them were a field worker or field hand. That's another term used for the slaves who are working on the plantation. So there are very few house slaves at that time. More information about the plantation system. So the cash crop grown in the upper north of the southern colonies like in North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland was mainly tobacco. In the lower South or Low Country, South Carolina and Georgia, the main cash crop before the invention of cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793, the main cash crop in the lower South was rice. Finally, concerning the tasks of the slaves on the plantation, the slaves have to do everything, and they have to learn the crop technology. So everything surrounding the production of a crop. So they, for instance, on a tobacco plantation, in addition to planting the tobacco, they also have to prepare the leaves of tobacco for market. They have to package the tobacco. They have to turn indigo plants into a blue dye, but some of them specialized in some crafts like carpentry, blacksmith, and tanning. So that's the main tasks of the slaves on the plantation. How about the living conditions of the slaves at that time? Slave housing was minimal, so it's the bare minimum. So some slaves may own furniture like bed, and some of them may even own cooking utensils, but that's not common. So the ownership of furniture and cooking utensils are different from one plantation to another. In the early years, they may get second-hand clothing from their masters. So these are clothes from England, basically. But later, especially when they start to grow cotton, the slaves have to spin their own fabric to make their own clothes. So that's about the clothing. With regard to the food, the slave food consists of corn and yam and sometimes salt pork. Now let's talk about the sexual life on the plantation. Interracial sexual activities between blacks, whites, and Indians existed since the beginning of English colonies. So as a result of that, we have what is called miscegenation or mixing of races and creolization. Creolization is specifically about the children of a white men and black slaves. So miscegenation and creolization cause physical and cultural change among the slaves. But generally speaking, interracial marriage between blacks and whites were usually banned in North America. So even in recent years, black and white were not allowed to marry in some states. Finally, let's finish this lecture with a case of Anthony Johnson, whom I introduced early in this lecture. Anthony Johnson was one of the very first Africans to arrive in Jamestown. So he came in 1621, and most likely he was treated as an indentured servant, and as such he earned his freedom a few years after his arrival, and was granted land in the colony. And later he and his family became a successful tobacco planter in Maryland. So that was the case of Anthony Johnson, and this case also proved that the status of indentured servant was applied to the early Africans who were brought to the English colonies. So that concludes this lecture 2.1. Please move to lecture 2.2 to continue the module.